The recent news out of Syria has had a few people contacting me, generally along the lines of, "Woo, thought that was over." Unfortunately, not, because the long running Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, has been in a state of hiatus since March 2020, but far from resolved. And now it has flared back into flame. So I thought I'd do an explanation on what is currently happening, as far as can be figured, and what the implications of the new situation are. But to start, it might be best to give a summary of the major players involved and who backs them. Notionally, the government of the country, and currently holding the capital of Damascus and the most territory, is the Syrian Arab Army, the SAA, which is under the command of Bashar al Assad, hence these forces often being called Assadists. Assad is a dictator who came to power in 2000, essentially replacing his father as president, and it was discontent with his rule that initially sparked off the civil war. This in turn has seen the SAA use incredible brutality against their own people, including the use of chemical weapons, and it is generally thought that his forces have killed around 200,000 civilians in the war, more than any of the other factions by far. Assad himself is of the minority Alawite Islamic sect, an offshoot of Shia Islam that has in the past been considered heretical, and much of his support comes from the coastal communities where the Alawites predominantly live. The Assadists count amongst their allies the Russians, Iran, and Hezbollah, and all three of these have played critical roles in keeping Assad and the SAA a force in Syria. Remember that because it's important to the current situation. Principal enemy of the Assadists currently, and the cause of the latest flare up, are Hayat Tahrir al Sham, HTS. Located in a bastion in the northwest province of Idlib, HTS are a Sunni jihadist organization whose origins go back to al Nusra, which was effectively Al Qaeda's representative movement in Syria, and from which it bloodily split in 2017. As a result, they have a rather vicious reputation for how they treat those who oppose them and impose Sharia law in the areas they control, but at the moment at least appear to be treating civilians correctly and have even reportedly reined in the excesses of some other jihadist groups. They are now the primary local Sunni force in the war, and as Sunni make up the majority of Syria's population, they do have a large pool of potential recruits to draw upon. In addition to this, they receive support from neighbouring Turkey and accept foreign jihadists into their ranks, with evidence that they maintain links with the Taliban in Afghanistan. HTS is designated as a terrorist outfit by the United States and most Western nations, and its leader, Abu Muhammad al Julani, has a $10 million bounty on his head. Remember this because that'll also be important later. Then we have the Syrian Democratic Forces. This holds a considerable amount of territory in northeastern Syria and is a coalition of different ethnic militias which coalesced to fight ISIS back in 2015. The SDF is the primary force sponsored by the United States and a number of other Western nations and was critical for the military destruction of ISIS, taking most of Daesh's territory and now effectively policing the former ISIS territories to keep a lid on them. When you hear of US troops in Syria, it is predominantly in SDF controlled areas that they are based, with some 900 US personnel assigned to help the SDF with this mission of keeping ISIS suppressed. As a result, there are close ties of cooperation between the international coalition forces and the SDF, who fought side by side from 2016 through to the capture of the last ISIS territory in 2021. However, the majority of the SDF strength comes from their Kurdish component, the YPG and YPJ, which puts them directly at odds with the next major player in the war, the Syrian National Army, the SNA. To be blunt, the SNA is predominantly a Turkish proxy army, which exists primarily to destroy the SDF, with the secondary role of fulfilling Turkish President Recep Erdogan's dreams of a new Ottoman Empire by putting Syria firmly back into the Turkish sphere of influence. The SNA have a terrible reputation for brutality to both captured enemy and civilians, and indeed many of their fighters are drawn from either former ISIS, who fled to Turkey, or from Turkish nationalists. The SNA is directly supported by the Turkish military, with heavy use of drones and artillery, and as a result are able to bring a lot of fire to the battlefield, which helps compensate for their reputation of fighting each other or going on looting sprees in captured areas. As a quick aside, here is a rough and ready way to identify which force you are looking at if you see them in pictures or on video. and that is their respective salutes. HTS and pretty much any Islamist group, including ISIS, use a single finger to indicate that there is but one God. The SDF use this two-fingered salute, akin to the Western peace sign. To be honest, despite the time I've spent with the SDF, I have no real idea why they use it. Maybe they just think it looks cool. The SNA use the Grey Wolf salute, which is the same as used by Turkish ultranationalists. And the main one we see nowadays from the Assadists is this. Now, it's important to note that any agreements reached on cooperation between any of these parties are measures of temporary convenience while other greater threats are dealt with. Because Syria is firmly in Highlander territory. When this is all over, there can be only one, and all of these groups are caught in a death clinch. Again, bear this in mind when reading anything about the situation there. So what is going on? Well, as said, the war had been in a sort of stalemate since 2020, with all the participants taking turns to periodically fight or ally with each other, but the situation on the ground being largely static. That all blew up on the 27th of November, when a coalition of jihadist forces led by HTS and assisted by the SNA launched their first major offensive since the Russians and Turks hammered out the ceasefire in 2020. Displaying that they hadn't been resting on their laurels since then, HTS and their associates managed to rout the Assadist forces and their Iranian militia allies around Aleppo, Syria's second largest city, taking the whole area in a matter of days. This has seen them seize considerable quantities of weaponry, including aircraft like L-39 light attack jets and MiG-23 fighters, though it is doubtful if any of this is flyable. A follow-up attack then cut the M5 highway, the principal artery between Aleppo and Damascus, and then, the bit firmly between their teeth, HTS started pushing south towards the city of Hama. They are currently attacking Assadist forces positioned just to the north of Hama and are making noises about the end of Assad and that they will be heading for Damascus soon itself. That might be presumptive, but Assadist forces do look to be taking a beating and to be in serious trouble, and the HTS's offensive has sparked renewed fighting all across the country. Firstly, the SNA have resumed their attacks on the SDF and been attacked in return, while the Americans, who have been the subject to rocket and drone attacks from the Iranian proxy militias in Syria and Iraq, have gotten some revenge. According to reports, the militias were ordered to rapidly move from their bases in Iraq to support the Assadists in the west of Syria, but their convoys were intercepted on the road by A-10s, with expected results. Indeed, it's a bad time to be an ally of Assad, which is probably why the HTS and the other groups are now able to make their moves. In the past, the SAA was heavily reliant on support from Russian aircraft, Wagner mercenaries, Hezbollah, and the aforementioned Iranian militias, under the control of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Council. But Russia is now rather committed to Ukraine, and their aircraft and their airborne forces, which in the past would likely have been deployed to support Assad, as well as the Wagner organization, have been gutted in that conflict. In fact, other than a few indiscriminate airstrikes, the Russians may be in the process of abandoning Syria, with reports that their naval contingent in the port of Tartus, composed of 3 frigates, a submarine and 2 auxiliaries, have departed the port as HTS closes in. If true, that's a major setback for Russia's strategic plans, as Tartus has long been their primary port in the Mediterranean. Similarly, Hezbollah are in no position to assist Assad, having taken considerable casualties in their recent conflict with Israel and needing time to re-establish their bases and strength. Meanwhile, on top of suffering casualties to their militias from American airstrikes, the Iranians have reportedly lost their most senior officer in the country, killed in Aleppo during the fighting. Mind you, things are a bit complicated for the Americans as well. As said, their main focus of support is on the SDF, and that force is now mobilising and fighting against the Turkish-backed SNA once again. Substantial SNA forces, including armour, have been sent to the town of Manbij, and at the time of this video going live, a battle is underway for the town. Thus, we have 2 separate forces, both being sponsored by various NATO nations, once again actively engaged in each other in conflict, a perfect epitome of a clash of interests. And as Turkey has already deployed forces into Syria to attack the SDF before, in 2018, it is entirely conceivable that this shall happen again, with only the US in a position to stop them. Which begs the question, will they? After all, in his previous term in the White House, President Trump effectively gave the Turks and their proxies a green light to attack part of the northern Kurdish enclave, territory that the SNA now use as a base. If the US does abandon the Kurds, then it is entirely possible that the SDF will be overrun if the Turks get involved, and the prison camps full of former ISIS supporters that the SDF guard will be flung open, meaning we can expect to see that force reappear. After all, plenty of the SNA are reportedly ex ISIS, so it seems entirely likely that should they liberate their former colleagues, a new organisation will form in northeast Syria. And while the Turks currently have sway over the SNA, I strongly doubt that'll last beyond their usefulness as supporters expiring, and Erdogan or his successors may learn to regret fostering Islamic extremists across their border, just as Assad has. Because ironically, Giuliani, head of the HTS, was sponsored by Syrian intelligence to go and fight the US occupation of Iraq in 2003. The circle really does turn, doesn't it? Giuliani represents a tricky proposition. He has survived the machinations of the Islamic jihadist movements for 20 years now, seeing out rivals and creating a highly effective military force. But he has also expressed the desire to make accords with the West. Now, take that as you like, but it is a matter of record that Giuliani has made overtures and, despite the bounty placed upon him, hasn't been actively targeted by the US since his rise to power. I'm not saying a detente between HTS and the West is likely, but I will say that in the mess that is Syria, probably best not to rule anything out. And I suspect that the soon to be incoming President of the United States is going to have yet another international situation requiring his attention urgently.